Yo, welcome back everybody to a brand new video, and today we're going to be doing the top 5 best decks for Hartford Regionals. Hartford is this weekend. I will be in attendance at Hartford, so if anybody wants to meet me, I will be at Hartford Regionals. I am super excited for it, and of course, the meta is looking pretty interesting right now coming out of Portland Regionals, and these are, in my opinion, what the top 5 best decks are going in to the Hartford Regional Championships, the ones that I think are going to do the best and have the highest percentage of win rate, and the ones that you probably need to keep your eye out for. And if you are looking to play a deck, maybe this list might help you decide what you want to play for this weekend at Hartford. If y'all are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. We are getting super close to 5,000 subscribers, so if you're not subbed yet, make sure to click that subscribe button down below and all that good stuff. And let me know what you think of the top 5 down below. If did I miss any decks that maybe should have made the list, I would be interested to hear. But without further ado, let's get into the top 5. Coming in at number 5, I've got Mew. Now, Mew is definitely an interesting deck right now in our format. It's a pretty strong Judge Path deck. Now, the problem with Mew is that it might be a worse Judge Path deck than Arctina. I think one of the big glaring weaknesses with Mew is that it does have a pretty awkward matchup against something like Gardevoir, and it can even struggle against Lostbox. Specifically, the Kyogre build of Lostbox can be difficult to beat. I think that's ultimately Mew's, kind of big downfall, is having a bit of a rougher time against Lostbox, because, like, Kyogre doesn't really go into Roxanne range, so all the Kyogre deck does is they'll knock out a 2-prizer, and they will basically avoid getting Roxanne, and they'll just try to work towards a late-game Kyogre, which can be difficult to deal with, and I do think that Mew is definitely in an interesting spot. The one thing I do like about Mew is that I actually think it has a better time into Arceus than most decks do right now, mainly because Mew can easily knock out Arceus Vs before they evolve. Now, its Arceus matchup isn't, like, super winnable, but honestly, the Arc matchup isn't terrible. Being able to, like, Judge Path an Arceus deck, specifically Arctina, where they don't play Pumpkaboo and they're relying heavily on just not having a path in play to do Starbirth, can be pretty good to take advantage of. And one of the things that does give Mew some legs, and I do think Mew has a better matchup into the Arceus decks than most decks do, but Mew's certainly not perfect right now. It does have that weak Lost Zone matchup, in my opinion. A good Lostbox player will know how to pilot the Mew matchup properly, in my opinion, and that makes it difficult. Mew's Guardian matchup is shaky too, mainly because if your path are not sticking, Gardevoir can very easily run you over. But Mew's still a pretty solid deck in my opinion, and still a top 5 deck in the format. I think its decent Arceus matchup is, I think, what gives it a higher placement on this list. And at number 4 is Gardevoir. Now, Gardevoir is no longer the best deck in the format, in my opinion. I think that it has been knocked down quite a few pegs because of its bad matchup spread that it now boasts. I think it has a difficult Lugia matchup, and I also think that its Turbo Lostbox matchup is really brutal. I think that's the thing that is ultimately going to kind of make Gardevoir, not as good. And the reason why we didn't see Gardevoir in Portland could be because of the dominance of Lostbox. Guardy has a pretty bad matchup against Lostbox. Specifically, the Turbo Lostbox deck is the one that Gardevoir will struggle with the most because of Sableye, and even Kyogre can be pretty hard to deal with too. So Gardevoir is definitely not in a great spot right now. I still think it's a pretty solid deck, though. It's still definitely in our top 5, and the reason I put it higher than Mew is because I think Gardevoir can still beat Lostbox over Mew. I think Mew has a harder time against Lostbox, or Gardevoir can still maybe beat Lostbox, though it is very difficult to beat Lostbox nonetheless. Like, both Guardy and Mew are both basically at the bottom of the top 5 because of their hard time versus something like a Lostbox deck. But Gardevoir is still fine right now. I think it's still decent into most decks. I think that its matchup against Arctina isn't that bad, as long as you're just not getting pathed into oblivion. I really think that Gardevoir should still be able to beat Arctina. I think that Gardevoir is fine right now in the meta. It's no longer the play, in my opinion. I think that it will still be played in Hartford. It'll still be fairly popular because Gardevoir is just a deck that a lot of people like to play right now, and there is still room for improvement. I think out of all the decks in the top 5 right now, I think that Gardevoir is clearly the one deck that has the most room for improvement. And I think we're going to see that in Hartford. I've got the highest placing list here from Portland. This is basically like towards list, except there's a Serena now instead of just one boss in the deck. And I think Gardevoir can definitely tweak around with how it wants to build its list, whether or not Gardevoir wants to play X card or this card to kind of try to beat something like Lostbox. So we'll have to see how Guardy can, kind of adapt to the meta in Hartford. Gardevoir is still fine right now, in my opinion. Still a decent deck in the format, though I just don't think that it is the best deck anymore. Though you still probably want to make sure your deck can beat Gardevoir or stand a chance. So you want to have a game plan against Guardy, because I think Gardevoir will still be popular. It's one of those decks that a lot of people just like to play, much like Mew VMAX, which we just said. I think that both these decks still have a decent amount of people that still play them, regardless of whether or not they're, best deck in the format material. But let's move on to what our number 3 spot is. And at number 3 is Arctina, the deck that won Portland Regionals. Now, Arctina is pretty solid in the format right now. I think after the Portland win, it's still fine to play, in my opinion. I don't think that because it won Portland, it's going to be like, people are going to tech against it. Because honestly, there isn't really a tech for Arctina. It's basically, you just play a deck that can stand up to it. And that's something like Mew. I think Gardevoir is okay into Arctina as long as their Path of Peaks are not sticking and you're able to kind of deal with Arctina. Arctina is not that bad of a matchup for Gardevoir. I think Arctina, it's just a solid all-around deck. It kind of takes like a 50-50 to mostly everything right now. That's kind of the way I look at Arctina, is it's good matchup spread across the board. Or semi-decent. I think it's tougher matchups. Something like Lugia can be difficult. If Lugia basically can set up, it's a little difficult to beat. I think Lugia can be a tougher matchup, even though you can beat it reasonably with like Path and Judge sticking. But ultimately, I think Lugia can still be a difficult matchup, especially if you're unable to get a V-Guard energy on like a Giratina and they're able to like T-Tar you. They have the single strike Urshi VMAX now, which is pretty threatening. So I think Lugia is still kind of a shaky matchup, but overall, I think Tina is just solid into most decks. Also, I guess its matchup against Lostbox is also hit or miss. I think the Kyogre build of Turbo Lostbox is Arctina's worst matchup right now, because Kyogre can be very difficult to deal with, though Arctina can still bully Lostbox by just having a bunch of Arceus in play and just being super tanky. Sunless will, of course, play the Charizard Care, and sometimes just constantly spamming Judge Path against Lostbox is enough to beat it. As long as you're just constantly using Arceus, you basically never use Squavette in the matchup against Lostbox, and you should be fine to kind of beat them by just attacking with Arceus and spamming Judge every turn. If you have a Charizard Care in your deck, you're going to have an easier time in a Turbo Lostbox, but Turbo Lostbox can be bad if they happen to KO your Arceus V with Dragonite on the first turn of the game. That's where that matchup becomes pretty shaky. But overall, Arceus Tina is pretty solid right now. It's probably the most like comfortable deck. It's the most like middle of the road deck. It's quite literally in the middle of our top 5 because it's the most middle of the road deck. It doesn't really have like any super favored matchups. It's just pretty good across the board into mostly everything and has 50-50s against most stuff. Its more shakier matchups again will be something like Mew can be difficult, and also I think Turbo Lostbox with Kyogre will be a little shaky too. But I think the deck is well-rounded. I mean, I think that Landon had like the perfect list, to be honest, with the shoes and the gloves. So I don't know if I think Belt might just be better. I think if Arctina is more popular going into Hartford because of its win, I would probably prefer just to go double Belt over the Cleansing Glove Belt split, so you're able to knock out opposing Arctina mirrors, where it can be like you kind of need the Belt, and only playing one Belt will be bad in the mirror because they can go V-Guard, and then if you can't one-shot a Giratina, you're basically screwed. So I really think that double Belt is the way to go in Arctina right now, but yeah, Arctina is basically just the best deck right now for just middle of the road stuff. It's a pretty straightforward deck. Judge Path is really strong, and that's a lot of the time how you're going to win games. It's just because Judge Path is a really good combo, and that's why it comes in at number 3. And at number 2, we have Lugia V-Star. Lugia did get second place at Portland, but I still think the deck is just insane right now. It is still a very strong deck, and if it can set up double Archeops turn 2, it can be very, very powerful and hard to beat and navigate the matchup. I think Reg and Retzloff's deck is honestly pretty perfect. I think the Urshifu VMAX is probably optimal going forward, and the deck is really, really good. I think that it definitely is easily the top deck right now in the format that relies on using V-Star Pokemon specifically, and this deck still has a good time into stuff like Gardevoir and Lostbox, though the Kyogre build of Lostbox is obviously going to be a little bit harder to beat than the normal Lostbox build, but even then, I think you can still probably be fine against the the Lostbox Kyogre build, but your Lostbox matchup is fairly decent too. Lugia is just a pretty good deck right now. It's all well-rounded, it has good matchups across the board. It's just down to whether or not you're feeling lucky. However, if this deck is just going flawlessly perfect and everything goes well, this deck is just basically insane, and it's very, very good. Lugia is tough to beat. I think it's fine against like Arceus too. If like you're just able to set up, you probably just beat Arceus because you can one-shot their stuff with T-Tar. You have the Urshifu, which is really good against Arctina. So yeah, I just think Lugia is just insane right now. It also has checks for Duraludon with that Urshifu. So if you're expecting Duraludon, which depending on what build of Arc you think is more popular, the Dura or the Tina build, you have the Urshifu, which probably handles both builds fine because you can trade blows into Arctina pretty well, as you're able to take out 2 Tinas with Urshifu, and then you also have the Urshifu, which can deal with a Duraludon pretty cleanly. So yeah, very strong deck right now. Definitely the second best deck going into Hartford, and it's very good. And I think that despite having that shaky Kyogre matchup, I think the deck is still pretty decent into most Lostbox matchups. All right, on to honorable mentions before we get to the number 1 spot. The first one I want to note was Goodra. I mean, Goodra is just one of those like decks that just kind of does what it does best, and I don't really think gains or loses any good bad matchups with our results from Portland. Going into Hartford, Goodra's still like a fine play. It's it's not terrible. It does struggle against Turbo Lostbox a little bit, especially the Kyogre build, but overall I think the deck is still pretty solid. A lot of people also do not know how to play against it. I think it's one of the big advantages is some people don't know how to play against Goodra, and that's a huge thing you have going for you. I think that the Spirit Mask build here, I got Andrew Mahone's list from Portland Regionals pulled up here for the honorable mention. I think the Spirit Mask, or Panic Mask, sorry, is actually really good. Panic Mask does allow you to prevent your Goodra from being KO'd by Zacian V in the Guardy matchup, and Guardy doesn't play tool removal, and that's one of the big things you do have going for you, is the power of Panic Mask against Gardevoir. And I still maybe would play the Panic Mask, because it still is a pretty good tech card in Goodra. It also could come up in matchups like Lostbox, where you can like prevent Dragonite from attacking you if you roll an Iron them, or you can prevent Meriden from attacking you sometimes. It's just a really cool card to play in the deck, and I do like the idea of Panic Mask in the Goodra deck. The next one we'll mention, I wanted to note, was going to be Sableye Charizard. A lot of people are still very high on this deck, and will say that it is a great deck. You can still easily get turn 2 Lost Mine. This is the highest placing Sableye Charizard deck from Portland Regionals, and I think the deck is still strong. Again, being able to potentially get turn 2 Lost Mine is insane. Radiant Charizard is still good. The downside of this deck is it has a harder time against Lost City-based decks, which is still going to be one thing that you do have to expect going into Hartford, is the popularity of Lost City, and that can be something that definitely will make this deck a little bit weaker, is how good Lost City is. But the deck is still really strong in my opinion, and this deck has a lot of potential, a lot of really cool pop-off turns with Charizard and the Cram. Being able to get turn 2 Lost Mine is good, and it might even have a better time into the Turbo Lostbox matchup if you can successfully get to the 10-card Lost Zone quicker. And then the next honorable mention I wanted to note was going to be the Dura deck. Dura is still one to be respected right now, and it seems like it is evolving over time. And we saw that Dura Vulpix won EUIC, and now we're seeing Dura Umbreon do really well in Portland. So I definitely am surprised to see Dura holding on, because, I mean, Dura is still just a really strong card right now. It's very good against Lugia still. Like, even with the Urshifu, it's still a threat nonetheless in the Lugia matchup for Lugia players, and I think that the deck is good. I like the idea of the Umbreon VMAX package with the Karen's Conviction. I actually think Karen's Conviction is going to be optimal now in Dura going forward, and I think that the Alakazam Hawlucha is also really, really good in the deck too. The Alakazam's kind of smart against Dragonite, so we'll have to see how that kind of adapts going forward. And I don't know if the Umbreon build is the way to go going into Hartford, but I do like this deck a lot, and I think that Dura is still something that people are going to play in Hartford. And then next up we have is Meriden. Meriden keeps getting top 8. I gotta keep mentioning Meriden on here, man. I think it definitely deserves an honorable mention at this point. The deck is still strong, and I think the thing that makes it so good is the ability to just take turn 1 KOs. And Meriden might actually have an easier time into Arc decks, because you're able to kind of get that easy pop-off turn with turn 1 Photon Blaster, and that can be really devastating. And it's just a very strong deck. I think the Magnezone is pretty good into Lostbox, especially with Turbo Lostbox, though you could try out like maybe Flying Pikachu, but I think Magnezone is just probably better, because you get so much tempo in that matchup. But yeah, Meriden is pretty strong right now, and I'm glad that Flaffy Meriden was able to do so well, because I was kind of into this deck at the start of the format, and I'm glad that it's seen results finally. But yeah, I think Meriden is still good, and it's one of those decks that people are just going to play regardless, because it's fun to play, and it's very good if it donks the opponent, which it can easily do a lot of the time, and that's one of the things that makes this deck such a threat. And those are all the honorable mentions I got noted here, and without further ado, let's get into the number 1 spot on the list. And at number 1, I think to no one's surprise, is Turbo Lostbox. Turbo Lostbox is by far the best deck right now. I actually think the Kyogre build is probably the way to go right now if you were to play this deck, but the normal build without the Kyogre is also still pretty strong. But yeah, Turbo Lostbox is just easily the BDIF right now. It's one of the things that is making stuff like Guardy pretty bad, is because of how good it is against Guardy. Dragonite is insane right now, especially when you get turn 1 Mirage Gate. I mean, turn 1 Mirage Gate Dragonite is just absolutely disgusting, and it is very, very good, especially against the Arceus matchup. And I think that Kyogre is probably the way to go when playing this deck, because it just gives you an easier time against most of the decks in the format that this deck might struggle against, and I think Kyogre will still be the way to go. The nice thing about this deck is not knowing, or the opponent not having the knowledge as to what you're playing, unless they know ahead of time. Like, depending on how you play the game, they're going to struggle to know whether or not you're playing Kyogre or whether you're not playing Kyogre, and that can make for some very interesting turns in the game where the opponent doesn't expect the Kyogre, they don't know you're playing the Kyogre. It's just an interesting kind of mind game you can play with this deck, and I think the Kyogre build is probably optimal, and I think that if your deck does not have a good time against Lostbox, I would not go to Hartford or play the deck, because I just don't know if there's much you can do if you can't beat Lostbox, especially Turbo Lostbox, which I expect to be the most popular deck in Hartford, and I definitely think it is the BIF right now. I think this deck is easily the deck to be right now in the format Turbo Lostbox, and it's good, man. You got to have a game plan against this deck, as it is extremely powerful, and I definitely would say that the Kyogre build is the one that is the best build of Lostbox right now. And yeah, that is it for me on today's top 5 video for the top 5 best deck for Portland. Let me know if I missed any deck. I did want to mention Alex Shemansky's Nicholas Moffat Moltres deck. That probably could be an honorable mention. That is another Kyogre deck, which you could kind of group into this, kind of build, even though it's not really the same deck. But I did want to note that as kind of another deck that maybe could have made the list, even though it probably would be a top 5 deck right now, to be honest. But anyways, that is it for the video. Hope you enjoyed. If you're new to the channel, again, make sure to subscribe down below. Help me on the road to reaching 5,000 subs here on the second channel. And I'll hopefully see some of y'all in Hartford, as I will be in attendance to Hartford myself. I'm excited for it all. Hope you all enjoyed, and bye-bye.